Ninamani mai yunga jajaga minimanyanga porka nainari Lester Irabinna Rigney. I am Professor Lester Irabinna Rigney, and I am going to be taking you through the second week lecture of the series in this course, and we're going to travel firstly what the lecture is called The Image of the Child, the first child art in history from the oldest culture in the world. And we're going to look at who was the first child in the world, and I'm going to argue that it was Aboriginal. And secondly, we're going to find out who is Aboriginal and what is the Aboriginal child. So firstly, I acknowledge the sovereignty and custodianship of the Kaurna people on which the land that I'm speaking on today. And there's two people that we would like to acknowledge today, and that is Dr. Alice Rigney of the local Kaurna community, powerful first female Aboriginal school principal in Australia who passed not long ago, and also Gadlabarti, a powerful Kaurna elder who was the keeper of the fire, and it's important that we acknowledge that these were two educators who had passed in the Kaurna community. Okay, in trying to understand who is the Aboriginal child and what image do we have of the Aboriginal child, I'd just like to let you know where I'm from. I'm from the Narungga Nation, and I was raised on a mission right up until I was 15. And on this mission, when I was born during a time where it was illegal to associate with whites. I was institutionalized on a mission. Blacks weren't allowed to leave the mission, and whites weren't allowed to enter. And so you can see here on the far left-hand screen, or your right-hand screen, I suspect, is the first the first white school that was set up here to teach black kids, and on our mission. And so you can see the image down the bottom of the Point Pearce Mission School. Whilst we spoke Narungga language, you can see that in this school was to teaching how to be English and anglicised. You can see the Australian flag below, and you can see the marching, and we're now starting to wear European clothes, whereas Narungga communities and Aboriginal peoples across the world previously had lived here for thousands of years, and education didn't arrive on a boat in Australia. It was always here for over 60 to 80,000 years. And this is testimony. This is some of the oldest artwork in the world. So we're going to talk about this. So the two propositions in our lecture today is the notion of what image of the Aboriginal child or the image of children do we have? And we want to postulate today is what image do we have of children? Do they have democratic rights at birth? The concept of child, as the image of child as the competent child, is one that we want to maintain and argue in this lecture today. The child as competent is one in which is not very well held up around parts of the world. Children are aspects and agents that don't have rights in some parts, and so we need to sort of unpack our concepts of the child, and particularly I want to unpack today a proposition, well, what is the Aboriginal child? How do we know this subject? And is this subject as child competent? And is this subject as child in the images that we have free of deficit? Or do we have deficits about these particular children? So we're going to look at these two propositions. So let's then begin with our try to look at some concepts of, from Vygotsky, and we'll get to Vygotsky in a moment. And Vygotsky is a really interesting theorist. He was born in Belarus around about 1896, and his life was cut short because he died from tuberculosis. But he made some significant discoveries in the groundwork for modern-day pedagogy. And Vygotsky spoke about what is our concept of the child as educators and what is our concepts of the teacher. And particularly, he goes on to sort of argue, well, what is our concept of schooling? What's the purpose of schooling? And these three concepts are fundamental to the lecture that I want to speak about today in trying to acknowledge, well, what and who is the Aboriginal child and what perceptions do we have of them? So the first one, this course has to deal with how we perceive Aboriginal children and also our self-perceptions as teachers and what is the purpose of public schooling. So Vygotsky would suggest that all children should be acknowledged as intelligent and competent citizens and that they have democratic rights from birth. And in essence, Vygotsky was suggesting that they do not come as blank slate to our classrooms. In actual fact, they are intelligent beings. And if we're not connecting to them or if they're not succeeding, it means that our pedagogies are at fault, not necessarily the child, or the child is without deficit. It's not the child's culture, it's the structures of schools and the way we teach. Secondly, Vygotsky discredited the notion that the child as subject is a subject to be taught, and that the teacher's role is to pour knowledge into this empty vessel. Well, Vygotsky had a concept and wanted teachers to see the child as a competent subject that brought knowledge to the classroom, and that this knowledge should be used by the teacher in order to synthesize and build as a framework onto new knowledges. Vygotsky also had this concept of the teacher as a transformative intellectual, and that builds on the funds of knowledge that all children bring to class. And Vygotsky discredited the notion that we should teach to us, these concepts of. He would discredit the notion of a highly scripted, narrowing focus, which of teaching that we're experiencing today under NAPLAN, where schools and teachers become engrossed entirely with teaching to a standard and trying to achieve a standard. Whereas Vygotsky was on about the competent child, and that if you were to teach the standards, this would not allow the child to be creative, innovative, and would reduce their abilities to show creativity and innovation, and therefore as becoming a knowledge understander and a knowledge producer. And also Vygotsky believed that public schooling was the engine room for equality, inclusion and democracy. It was a place where children should be belonging, feel the sense of belonging, and it was for the public good. The public schooling system was not a place, according to Vygotsky, for privatization or profit making. It's not a business. Schools aren't there to make a dollar. In actual fact, what they are there is to increase the concept of the good citizen. So, in essence, what I want to focus on today is Vygotskyan notions of the central idea for human beings is to learn in social cultural environments with support and guidance from those who know more. So Vygotsky famously termed the zone of proximal development and socio-cultural environments, such as classrooms, ideally operate as supportive arenas to develop young minds from what they've already learnt from their families and their relatives and from their cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So these are what I would argue are some of the basic pedagogical principles. Pedagogy meaning teacher practice inside of the classroom. Pedagogy is those things, in my experience over the last 20 years, Pedagogy is defined as those things that you have already prepared and ready to work with children on how to deliver the knowledge, the curriculum. It's not necessarily the curriculum, it's separate from that, although now it's been integrated in a whole range of different ways. But I want you to see pedagogy as the things that you take into your classroom, which you're then going to turn children on to the curriculum, those methods and tactics. So if we take Moll and Louis Moll and Gonzalez's work, Vygotsky and Dewey, they all have similar things, aspects to them. And that is a cognitivist approach, a constructivist approach, not a cognitivist, a constructivist approach, whereby you're constructing knowledge from the child and therefore you're building a child-centered learning. So what are some of these aspects and for principles, what are some of these basic pedagogical principles for Aboriginal education? Well, if we're using a Vygotskian notions, where it's the teacher that builds on the experiences, abilities and funds of knowledge that the child brings to class. And one of the key aspects of this approach is that you've got to get to know your students, their histories, their backgrounds, their likes, their strengths, their weaknesses. And that the teacher needs to come to know the cultures, languages and literacies from which the students emerge. And that student cultures, languages, literacies are treated as a resource, not as impediments to excellence or schooling learning or school learning. One of the key aspects that the Vygotskians treat is that the teacher needs to increase inside of the classroom high intellectual challenge, that the child is a competent subject and we should have no lower expectations of children, and that our learning needs to be child-centred and child-driven inside of the classroom, and that we should give up our deficit thinking about certain children, about their genders, about their class, about their culture. And we need to tap into this notion of this cultural repertoire that the child brings from the community, their family, their local groups, and brings into the classroom, and use and draw upon these cultural repertoires as strengths that the child brings. So at the heart of a neo-Vygotskian theory in learning in diverse cultural contexts, at the heart, this is what Truba suggests, at the heart of academic success, and regardless of the child's ethnicity or historical background, an effective learning environment must be constructed in which the child, especially the minority child, is assisted through meaningful and culturally appropriate relationships. In other words, effective learning requires the child and adult to share cultural values and patterns, and that they communicate effectively between one another. So it's important that you get to know your child. So let's go back to this proposition that I put first. What is the image of the child that you have? Particularly, what is the image of children and what is the image of Aboriginal children in Australia particularly? Well, let's go back and in the project that I've been working on for the last 30 years is trying to chase the first child in world history. Who was she? Where did she come from? How did she present to the world that she was the first child? Now, this research has been going on for years. And in actual fact, I'm only one of 5 scientists around the world that are trying to chase who the first child was, using the out of Africa scientific theory of DNA testing and geneticism. So, if we look at Professor Chris Clarkson from University of Queensland in 2017, published in the rigorous scientific journal called Nature, and his thesis has proven now, without question, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the oldest people in the world, and they have been the first peoples on the planet to come out of Africa under the Africa theory, out of Africa theory, and these people, Aboriginal Australians, as I said, his theory is suggesting that they have been here for 60 to 80,000 years old, from 80,000 years. So that is, China can go back 5,000, 6,000 years the most. And the Egyptians are building pyramids in Cairo at 6,000 years. So Indigenous Australians out of Africa theory have been here for over 60,000 years, which makes them the oldest people on the planet. And so as they came across from Indonesia, Sundar, they came across from Indonesia via, because the oceans were still, there was a trough there that they needed to cross via a series of boats and crossings, so they would have had to have made rafts. But they make their extraordinary journey, which is the greatest migration journey in world history. They come out of Africa through Indonesia, and then they build boats and crafts, and then they arrive in Australia. The question is, did a child arrive on those boats, or did children emerge once they arrived in Suhal, which was Australia at that time? So, by definition, in terms of DNA and out of Africa theory, we know that Aboriginal Australians are the oldest humanity's oldest civilization. And if we're going to look where the first child emerges, it is in Aboriginal Australian art that we would try to locate where the child presents itself in Aboriginal rock art. So I've got some, I want you to now watch where the first human beings emerge, which is out of Africa, Aboriginal peoples walk, and then they come into Australia. And then secondary and thirdly, evolutions come out of Africa and then move into Europe. So man and woman and child are in Australia well and truly before they occupy Europe. So let's see if we can get this journey. So what we're getting a sense here is that the first waves out of Africa, the first human migration is into Australia, and then later it moves up into Europe.
Research headed by Professor Lester Irabinna Rigney from the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen shows that modern humans colonized the world twice. This is in contrast to previous scientific beliefs that humanity discovered the world outside Africa in one way derived from the DNA of a 100-year-old lock of hair like this. The lock of hair belongs to an Aboriginal man from the Goldfields region of southwestern Australia. The research team from the University of Copenhagen has succeeded in isolating and mapping the genome from the lock of hair. This is possible because the DNA encapsulated in hair is quite well protected from the ravages of time. And the genome analysis has proved that modern humans, Homo sapiens, populated the world in two waves. The first wave, from about 70,000 years ago, reaches all the way to Australia. The second wave mixes with relatives of the Aboriginals in Asia, but never reaches Australia.
This really changes the conception also of how genetically similar people are outside Africa. It now turns out that they are more diverse than we thought. And 1 year, 2 years from now, it could very easily, or it's very likely, I think, that we will see other studies showing that there might have been additional migration waves into it.
So, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their children have lived in Australia for a long time. And we know that at the glacial ice age had just started to melt, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples cross the trough and then move into what we now know as Australia. And so this is the current state in which we know Australia and most teachers and most students. However, this is Indigenous Australia, and what happens is they generally come across the trough and they enter into this area over here, the Kimberley. And what they tend to do is they split into two, and one group goes around the east coast and the other group goes around the west coast. And they meet up at this very place in South Australia on the homes of the Ngarrindjeri, Gauna and Narungga. And as they meet here in South Australia, they begin to move into the interior. As they go around the outside of Australia, these two groups are moving into the interior. And once they get to their locations, they stop for hundreds and hundreds of years and learn about that notion of culture and identity and what's going on in their particular location. So Indigenous Australians, if the child here has been here for so long, then why is the Aboriginal child only coming into view in Australian education policy around the 1970s? Yet the Aboriginal child has been here for almost 70,000 years. Why is it late for their needs and interests to be met by dominant Australia that's colonised Australia from England? These are the questions that we need to ask. But also now we've got newcomers to Australia, and Australia is becoming highly super diverse. And we've got a whole range of migrations that's come not only from England, but from everywhere. Now in 2018, 1 in 4 Australians were born overseas, and 1 in 2 have an overseas parent. So we've got a whole range of overseas migrations which are represented in 60% of Australia's population growth. So now, not only do we as the teachers need to be aware of the diversity amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but our classrooms also have to be ready for a whole range of super diverse classrooms, suburbs, environments in which Australia now finds itself. So I went chasing to see if I can find the first child that possibly came across from Indonesia, and how this child presents itself. When we go to look for this first child, we would have to chase Aboriginal rock art to see where a 0 to 6 child begins to paint with their elders on rock. Once we establish how old this rock is, we then get a sense of whether the child can only present itself through this particular artwork. And this is the site of which I've been investigating in the local Kimberley region, which is the oldest in the country, where I'm chasing children's rock art, which hopefully will give us, when dated, the first child's painting artwork in the world. So I've just returned from a 3-week research investigation in the Kimberley, and I just wanted to show you a few photos of where I've been chasing this child. So the rock art in the Kimberley are the oldest in the world, by the oldest people in history. And so when we go and chase it, we go through, when we're looking for the first Aboriginal child's artwork from 0 to 6, we can try and see how these artworks have lasted. Now, I'm in some of the oldest parts of the Kimberley, and this would possibly might be the first drawing of an echidna in Australian history, drawn on rock art in shelters which are done by possibly some of the first migrants to Australia, the Aboriginal issues. So this is called the Guangguan art, which is the oldest art in Australia and in the world, and it's also known as the Bradshaws, after a man who possibly first European person to find them. So we see these artworks. The question then is, which artworks have been done by a child from 0 to 6? And is this the first, this is how the first child in the world presents itself. So here I am chasing these artworks with colleagues from other universities and specialists, rock art specialists, anthropologists, archaeologists. And here we see an Aboriginal artwork of Diprotodon, which is clearly, they're painting at the, just on the cusp of the edge of the dinosaurs. And so some of this rock art, when you're looking for it, is so old, and the techniques for dating it is quite tricky, and we're still trying to find out different ways of trying to date it. These are some of artefacts and rock shelters that we've looked at. This is Windjina. This is a different art form in the Kimberley, and this is a very spiritual creator. And they don't have any mouths. But what we see here is possibly leading to, our closer to trying to find where this first child is. What you see here is Aboriginal ancestry, elders' handwork over here. You can clearly see it right over here. This is the elders' handprint. But what you can see here is clearly an adolescent or a younger handprint from, it's clearly not the size of a 0 to 6 hand, but it's clearly not an elder or an elderly person, man or woman. And we can track some of these artworks to, around about 10,000 years old. But this is really unique. This one here, you can see this hand down here is very much falls into the measurements of somewhere between 0 and 6, compared to what you have over here with the elder's handprint. And equally, this handprint over here is clearly starting to get us excited about how old these children are when they're putting their handprints up onto a wall and then with guidance by the elder making these first. Is this the first child's in the world? We simply don't know. But what we are doing is trying to see how rock art can assist us in tracking down. And Aboriginal children throughout the Kimberley paint as they have a high intellect around painting, and they know their country, they know fruits, they have descriptive terminologies in 3 different languages other than English on plants and medicines and so on. They can fire stick farm. They know all about fire stick farming at the age of 12. They know which to burn, when to burn, what season. They want to burn cold fires. The cold fires are burnt during winter to remove all of the debris and from fires from becoming super hot fires in the summer, which just destroy everything. So they burn off in cold, cold winter, and it just removes all of the debris so that extreme fire patterns of hot, hot fires in summer can't take hold. And Aboriginal children in this area are taught this before the age of 12. And this is the cypress tree, and you can see when it's not cared for through fire stick farming, on my right hand side, they're burnt to total cinder. Whereas on the, when they're fire stick farmed, children are taught how to burn around the cypress tree and protecting it from burning from hot, hot summers. And these children are told how to navigate different fruit and vegetables. And so they are highly literate. And the Aboriginal child can speak up to several different languages. Yet when they go to modern Western schools and they're wanting to catch this cultural capital and cultural knowledge that they have, sometimes the teacher in the school is only buying the currency of English. Sorry, this is an English-only space. And so monolingualism causes monoliteracies. These rich funds of knowledge that the child have, they're not literate. They're not illiterate. They are highly literate and they are highly knowledgeable. Yet schools sometimes only focus on one form of literacy, and they define it very narrowly, and that is as English literacy. The question is, as teachers, how do we tap into this knowledge that the child brings from home? And how do we use that knowledge as the basis by which to build new knowledge onto? So I'm running out of time, but Aboriginal children still paint their artwork. Even though this is thousands of years old, you saw the Wandjina in the cave, in the rock art. However, here are young people painting their images still. And so this thousands of years of knowledge is still passed down. However, as teachers, we're sometimes only looking for one source of knowledge, and that our default position as teachers, we sometimes look for those things that we have in our heads, not what the child has in theirs. And so Aboriginal people throughout colonisation were dispossessed of their language and dispossessed of their culture and dispossessed of their land. And in a new form of education system was imparted in Australia. So during the assimilation era, and the next two lectures will talk a little bit about the assimilation period. I'm not going to do that today. But during the assimilation period, it was illegal for Aboriginal children to bring their culture to school or to bring it into society. And here we have a certificate whereby Aboriginal people, as a part of the Assimilation Act, had to give up being Aboriginal in order to belong into the new Australian society under British rule. So here, this individual would have had to have agreed to cease to be Aboriginal, and because of his characters and ethos and values, he no longer would be declared as Aboriginal under the Aborigines Act, and therefore he would then now be declared as white. Now, whilst this may had merits, he would then become an outcast in the Aboriginal community and in the white community as a result, and so therefore, as a way of integrating Aboriginal peoples to Australian society was a total shambles. And so it just didn't work. And in schools, Aboriginal children were expected to leave their culture at the door, and so were many new migrants under the White Australia policy that restricted migrants from Europe and only allowed British immigrants of white stock. So we now know a little bit about the Aboriginal child, and it may have disrupted some of the images that you possibly have of children generally. But let's look at some of the first artwork about non-Indigenous children in the colony. How were they viewed by the rulers at that time? Well, here are some of the first images that we're looking at that were sent back to the Empire and was a sort of reflection of what was happening in the colonies at that time. And so what we're trying to look for is when the first child, European child in Australia, first presents itself. It doesn't present itself through its own paintings like on rock art that we've seen. It presents itself through an interpretation by others, by other adults. And so what we see here is, a Hans Huyssen painting called The Mystic Morn, where animals get privileged into artwork rather than children and society. And so this is, the imagery of the nation was built on the back of the sheep and the cow. And so Tom Roberts' breakaway here, you never see children here, you see adults controlling the land, controlling the landscape and using agriculture and animal husbandry to do it. You don't see Aboriginal peoples in these paintings, in some of these paintings. They're just painted out. They're non-existent. There's terra nullius. They don't exist. What we see here from Frederick Woodhouse is, the gentrification, the adults coming in and colonising the country, and the aristocrats, the upper rich. You see statues and monuments to ruling parties, but very rarely do we see children. This is one of the first, possibly the first Aboriginal child painted by non-Aboriginal people in Australia. And what we see it in the 1800s, which is relatively new. But you see the Aboriginal child, the woman is gazing at the Aboriginal child, and you can see who's doing all the work here. And but you've got sort of the Aboriginal child half naked, whilst as Samuel Gill is, the others are all clothed. And here you see Thomas Bain painting the hostile natives. These are actually youth, and we know that because they're uninitiated men from an Aboriginal perspective. And you've got men who are on horseback, and so this isn't a fair fight. And Thomas Bain is clearly sort of painting here that it's the natives that are the hostile ones. Yet, you've got men on horseback with guns fighting children with stones and wooden implements. It's a bit like the Palestinian and the Israeli conflict at the moment. You've got guns and you've got stone throwers, and it's a very depressing type of aspect to see. This one here, you've got Lambert painting the historical incident, and we see the non-Indigenous child painted as the hero here, the marauding savages, storming the homestead, and the child is protecting it. So the child starts to emerge here in paintings as something to uphold. You here have an Aboriginal child, we think, that's on the back of this woman, and Alexander Schramm writing Civilization versus Nature, and you've got the anvil and the metal and the pipe, and then you've got the wooden implements with the Aboriginal people, and the child sitting in the back. Then the child is painted on the parents of the uncivilized, natured version, whereas the civilized has no child, but has steel and the anvil. And this is what some of the first time, this is actually a Ngarrindjeri community, actually, down south, and around the Coorong. And you see Alexander Schramm here painting a non-Indigenous child with for the first time we're seeing here, a non-Indigenous child painted in the same painting as an Aboriginal child on the back of the man in the centre of the painting near the door. And so these are when we see where the child emerges, both black or white in paintings, it's really, really tricky to try and find solid images or concepts by Australia about how proud they are of their children, both black and white. And it's quite unusual as a social scientist to see, whilst these children appear quite aspect, although late, in paintings, they don't get any educational aspects until educational policies are developed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So their rights, their views, their interests are very late. And we can go on. I don't want to spend too much time. I've got too much other theory to get through. But here's a child. This is an adolescent woman coming, and you can see this plays into the stereotype of Aboriginal child as a beggar. And you've got a non-Aboriginal woman with 2 children, and the mother is very concerned about what the child does to the Aboriginal adolescent. And you even got sort of Samuel Gill, and Aboriginal adults are childlike in a sense, and they're playful and so on, and they're wonderful to be around, and they're interesting to look at. A bit of a novelty. They're the sort of this image, and then you sort of have Truganini, who was a teenager at this stage here. The greatest myth in Australia is that there's no Aboriginal Tasmanians, or that they were wiped off the face of the earth. In actual fact, they weren't. And then you have here is native dignity, Samuel Gill, the noble savage. If the Aboriginal child could only be like non-Aboriginal children, or the Aboriginal adult could only be like non-Aboriginal adults, then they would make something of themselves and become integrated into society. So here you have the first instances where Aboriginal culture is devalued and the deficit of the child is increased. So what do we do when we have suffered this type of history, where we know the child has been here for so long, yet their rights and their interests and their values, their beliefs are so late to come to educational policy and the way in which we teach them in Australia? Well, pedagogy, according to Ladwig and King, is the primary point for any educational change or development. The pedagogical development has greater influence on student improvement than the impact of curriculum and school organisation. Really, it's teachers that make a difference. And unless you have an understanding of the image of an Aboriginal child as positive, as competent, and not deficit, then you will always trip up in education around any child. We have to, as teachers, have positive perceptions and images of our children, of all children, as competent subjects. And that our classroom is a democratic place for inclusion. And so Ladwig and King tell us that pedagogy, our teaching ways, our teaching practices, our teaching techniques, not necessarily the curriculum. We have to use our teaching techniques to make the curriculum dance. So Malaguzzi and Rinaldi say, teaching is not about teaching children or people what to think. It's teaching people to, it's not about teaching people to think like me. Teaching is about teaching people to think, to critically analyse, to examine. And this is fundamental Vygotskian process, is that we have to teach people to think. Teaching is not a profession about teaching people to think like me. So we're now starting to move into some cultural responsive pedagogies. What pedagogies that we use as teachers that are culturally responsive to the child, that draws on their funds of knowledge that they bring to school? Well, Gloria Ladstone Billings is famous in her seminal paper, and she suggests that students must experience academic success. There's no two ways about it. Our job here is to make sure we have high expectation and high intellectual achievement of students. But students also need to develop and maintain their cultural competence of their own and about other cultures in the school, in order for the school to social cohesion of the society that they live in. And secondly, The job, according to Gladstone Billings, is children to develop a critical an awareness, a consciousness of the challenges of society and how to fix them. So a critical awareness and a critical consciousness about not only their own selves, but those in other cultures across the world. So in essence, the voice we want in our classrooms and our teaching methods is dialogic. That is, in dialogue with our children, not as monologic. Monologic pedagogies are, I'm just doing the curriculum to the child. I'm not interested in what they know or the literacies they bring from home. They are empty vessels, and as a teacher, my job is to pour knowledge into them. That is a monologic model. A dialogic model is the ability to set the learning task and allow the child to bring their knowledge and culture and language to that task. And this is a form of democracy where the child is democratic in and included and feels a sense of belonging when we do dialogic pedagogies, where the child has a sense of who they are but can bring their knowledges and their strengths to the learning environment that I've structured in a democratic way that includes their voice and their agency. Monologic is highly scripted, it's transmission, it means that I'm doing education to the child. Dialogic means that it's child-centered learning, where the child is engaged with the teacher in developing coherent, logical, robust, innovative ways of learning and teaching. Now, there's one that goes across in Alaska, and that is that the cultural responsive teacher standards. And in Alaska, they're suggesting that a culturally responsive way to teach children, and we're suggesting that this works in Aboriginal education, is that the teacher's philosophy must encompass multiple worldviews, that multiple knowledges are allowed in the classroom, multiple literacies and multiple worldviews. The learning theory and practice knowing of how the students learn, that's critical. The teacher must know her craft. The third point for the Alaskans are that we need to teach for diversity, and that the content related to the local community, and that the instructions and assessments are built on what the students' cultural knowledges and literacies and languages are, and that the learning environment utilises local sites, the family and community are involved as partners, and that the professional development, ongoing learning by the teacher is provided. So in essence, we've got culture matters in a school where there is high diversity, including Aboriginal peoples, and in high disadvantage areas, the culture of the local area matters inside the school. Place matters. That localising your curriculum and your pedagogies, taking them out to sites outside of the school into the local community, introducing them to the local businesses, the local industries, the local communities that are trying to save the river from pollution, the local communities that are trying to grow the food for the local communities. The child's voice matters. So voice in a culturally responsive pedagogy matters. In Aboriginal education, the child voice matter. Creativity matters. Art matters. So it's not STEM, it's STEAM. It's including the arts in everything. That the teacher has to see the child as competent subject, and we as teachers must acknowledge that the child has democratic rights at birth. So if the Muslim child or the Aboriginal child are not getting their needs met at school, it's not an Aboriginal problem or a Muslim problem, it's a problem of democracy. Democracy isn't being enacted for these children. And the one sure way that a child can receive their democratic rights, citizenship rights at birth, is through the learning environments of the school by which how the teacher constructs their learning environments. So their knowledges and cultures that Aboriginal children bring should be seen as assets by the teacher, not as deficit. So back to your view of Aboriginal children or any child that you have in your classroom. What's the image of the child that you have? Will they be their knowledges and languages be included? How will your pedagogies be creative to turn them on to new knowledge through the ones that they already have? How will you enable their voice to be heard? Or are you just doing the transmission, the teacher doing stuff to this child? Or do they have a say in their own learning? And when they do have a say, you are enacting the principles of democracy. So as teachers, we need to focus on what they bring to school, the assets, the cultural and knowledge assets that they already have. And focus less on more than focus less on what they don't have. So what they have more than what they don't have. So we've spoken about this, knowing your students, high intellectual challenge, child-centered learning, no deficit thinking, building on their cultural repertoire. And so I now want to spend, in conclusion, the last 5 minutes on what is and who is an Aboriginal learner. And so we focused a little bit about, in the who is the Aboriginal learner, about this map. And all of us have this map, but this is the map that Aboriginal children, we're all literate and numerate in this map. But this is the map that Aboriginal children are highly numerate and literate. And they'll be seeing whether you are numerate and literate in this map. There are 250 Aboriginal languages that were spoken in Australia, and between 50 to 100 languages are left. And there are still many Aboriginal Englishes spoken. The question is which current language situation is operating in your class that you can build into your classroom. That means, what is the definition of literacy? What does it mean to be literate? In whose language and in whose interest? You have to accept in your classroom multiple literacies, multiple knowledges and multiple languages. And if you're only buying English literacy and English numeracy, then you are going to miss the beautiful talents of all of your children in your classroom. We know that Australia has been colonised. And here's where I grew up on a mission, and that was my house. And even though I spoke 2 Aboriginal languages, the local Christian school was only buying English only. And this is me as a child with my family practicing my knowledges. So Indigenous children, there are roughly around about 140,000 in schools, and 90% of students are aged between 12 to 15. So they're in junior primary, early childhood and middle school really. And if I step aside here, you can see the difference in the population. You'll see the blue, which is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and you get a sense here that the age profile, where approximately 65 to 70% of the Aboriginal population are under the age of 25. Very few elders, and this is a statistic pretty much around the world from other colonised countries in English Anglophone countries and Commonwealth countries. You also, whereas the non-Indigenous population pretty much the majority are elderly, whereas the majority of Aboriginal populations are under the age of 25. Very, very, very young population. Do Aboriginal children live out in the remote desert? No, they live amongst you. So if you look at the pie chart, 25% of Aboriginal children live in remote communities. That's remote communities. Whereas the majority of Aboriginal children live in major cities, or they live in country areas, in regional and rural areas. So, you've almost got 40, 50, 60, 70% of people living either in cities or in country, just urban areas. Sort of regional areas. Here in 2001, where the remote Aboriginal communities live in as a gross population demographic, and here are the distances that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children with their parents are travelling to get basic services like registration of a car, going to the doctor, going to get food, stores and so on. You know, some of these, if you have a look here at this aspect here from this group travelling into Alice Springs, I mean, that's almost a day's drive to get kidney dialysis when mum has to go from Western Australia into Northern Territory to get kidney dialysis, and she takes the 3 kids with her. So this interrupts education. If we have a look here, out of OECD countries, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, school achievement at the age of 15 in maths out of all OECD ranking in Australia, Indigenous peoples in Australia rank 29 out of 31. They are better only than Turkey and Mexico. And so whilst Indigenous Australians at the age of 15 aren't doing very well on math, Australians aren't doing that well, but they're 8 out of 30, whereas Indigenous Australians are 29 out of 31. So we have some real serious problems here in early childhood, going all the way through to the age of 15, which is early high school. And here you see Indigenous students who achieved the National Medium Standards for English Reading 2009. The further remote you are out in year 3, 5, 7 and 9, the less likely you are to achieve an Aboriginal, a standard of reading or English reading. And these are some appalling statistics that have been going on for 10 years. And these are some of the classrooms that you will inherit. And we have to try and change using culturally responsive techniques and pedagogies that I've outlined. And here you see the Closing the Gap targets. They're pretty much all failed. One of the disturbing ones is the life expectancy rates on Aboriginal children have not changed. Aboriginal children die earlier as a child mortality rate, in high proportions than non-Indigenous children. So the educational and cultural context in which students learn to be literate must consider in its planning effective teacher and learning both English and Aboriginal and languages. Thank you very much. My whole point about this lecture is that culturally responsive pedagogies that sees the child as competent subject, has democratic rights at citizenship birth, must make our way into our classrooms. Thank you.